It all started on a chilly Tuesday morning, the kind where the air feels heavy with tension. Karoline Leavitt walked into the courtroom wearing a determined expression that matched her sharp blazer and neatly tucked shirt. She wasn't just any journalist. She was someone who had made a name for herself by digging deep into stories others were too scared to touch. This time, however, she found herself not behind her desk typing away but standing in front of Judge Roberts, one of the most powerful figures in the local judicial system. The case revolved around an explosive article Karoline had published weeks earlier. In it, she exposed shady dealings involving some big names in the city's government, people who were supposed to serve the public but seemed more interested in lining their own pockets. Her investigation didn't just point fingers. It laid out hard evidence, connecting dots that no one else had dared to connect before. And while the story gained widespread attention and praise from ordinary citizens, it also drew the ire of those implicated, including individuals close to Judge Roberts himself. When the hearing began, the atmosphere in the room was tense. Lawyers shuffled papers, reporters scribbled notes furiously, and spectators whispered among themselves, wondering how this showdown would play out. Karoline sat quietly at first, listening as lawyers argued back and forth over whether her article constituted defamation or if it was simply a brave act of journalism. But when it came time for her to speak, things took a dramatic turn. Karoline stood up confidently, ready to defend her work. She held folders filled with documents, bank statements, emails, and testimonies from whistleblowers, all carefully organized to prove her points. As she began explaining her findings, the energy in the room shifted. People leaned forward, hanging on to every word. It was clear she knew what she was talking about, and she wasn't backing down easily. But then, something unexpected happened. Before Karoline could finish presenting her evidence, Judge Roberts interrupted her mid-sentence. His voice boomed across the courtroom, demanding silence. He accused her of being disrespectful to the court and warned her to stop speaking immediately. The suddenness of his reaction left everyone stunned. Some people exchanged confused glances, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Others shook their heads in disbelief, sensing that something wasn't right. Things escalated quickly after that. When Karoline tried to explain why her evidence mattered, Judge Roberts grew even angrier. He slammed his gavel repeatedly, each strike echoing through the silent room like thunder. Then, in a move that shocked nearly everyone present, he announced that Karoline was in contempt of court. Without giving her much of a chance to respond, he slapped her with a hefty fine of $50,000. Just like that, a respected journalist was hit with a financial penalty that felt less like justice and more like punishment for daring to challenge the status quo. As the news spread outside the courtroom, reactions poured in from all sides. Supporters of Karoline called it an outrageous abuse of power, arguing that the judge's actions reeked of bias. Critics, on the other hand, claimed she had crossed a line by pushing too hard during the proceedings. Social media lit up with hashtags like Stand with Karoline and Justice for All, turning the incident into a national conversation overnight. What struck many observers most was the way Karoline handled herself throughout the ordeal. Despite the weight of the moment, she remained composed. There were no tears, no raised voices, just quiet determination etched across her face. As she gathered her belongings and prepared to leave the courthouse, she paused briefly near the exit. Reporters swarmed around her, microphones thrust forward, eager for a comment. Instead of lashing out or showing fear, she offered a simple yet powerful statement. This isn't over, not by a long shot. Her words lingered in the minds of those who heard them, sparking curiosity and speculation. Was this truly the end of the road for Karoline, or was she planning something bigger? No one knew for sure, but one thing was certain. Whatever came next, it was going to be anything but ordinary. Karoline stepped out of the courthouse, the weight of the $50,000 fine hanging over her like a storm cloud. Cameras flashed in her face, reporters shouted questions, and bystanders whispered among themselves. The world seemed to be watching, waiting to see how she'd react. Would she crumble under the pressure? Would she lash out in anger? Or would she find a way to fight back? But Karoline didn't do any of those things. Instead, she stood there at the bottom of the courthouse steps, took a deep breath, and looked directly into the cameras. Her voice was calm but firm as she said, "This isn't over. In fact, it's just beginning." Those words sent a ripple through the crowd. Some people nodded approvingly, others exchanged skeptical glances, and a few even rolled their eyes, thinking, she was just putting on a brave face. But deep down, Karoline meant every word. As she walked away from the chaos, slipping into the back seat of a waiting car, her mind was already racing. She knew the fine wasn't just about punishing her for speaking up in court. It was a message, a warning to anyone else who might dare to challenge the system. Judge Roberts wanted to make an example of her, to show that crossing certain lines came with consequences. But what he didn't realize was that Karoline had been preparing for this moment long before she ever set foot in his courtroom. Back at her small apartment, Karoline spread out her notes and documents across the dining table. Papers were everywhere. Bank records, emails, transcripts of secret meetings, all meticulously organized. She had spent months gathering evidence not only for the exposé that landed her in trouble, but also for something bigger, something she hadn't revealed yet. Sitting there, surrounded by years' worth of research, she allowed herself a brief moment to feel the gravity of the situation. A $50,000 fine was no joke, especially for someone who lived paycheck to paycheck. But instead of feeling defeated, she felt more determined than ever. The next morning, Karoline called together a group of trusted allies. These weren't just random friends or colleagues. They were people who shared her passion for uncovering the truth. There was a retired investigative reporter who had mentored her early in her career, a tech-savvy activist who could dig up digital dirt faster than anyone she knew, and a young lawyer eager to take on cases that mattered. Together, they formed a tight-knit team ready to tackle whatever came their way. "We need to hit back," Karoline had told them, pacing the room as she spoke. "Not recklessly, but strategically. We can't let this fine silence us. If anything, we should use it to amplify our message." Her team nodded in agreement. They all knew the risks involved, but none of them hesitated. This wasn't just about one journalist fighting for her rights. It was about standing up against a system that often prioritized power over justice. Over the next few days, they worked tirelessly, combing through files, cross-referencing information, and piecing together a puzzle that painted a damning picture of Judge Roberts himself. What they uncovered was staggering. It turned out that Judge Roberts wasn't as clean as he pretended to be. Documents showed suspicious real estate deals tied to his family members, transactions that smelled of money laundering. Emails hinted at cozy relationships between him and some of the very officials Karoline had exposed in her article. And then there were testimonies from former court employees who claimed they'd been pressured to stay quiet about questionable rulings and unethical behavior. With each new discovery, Karoline grew more confident. She realized that Judge Roberts had underestimated her. He thought finding her would scare her into submission, but instead, it had lit a fire inside her. Now, she had everything she needed to turn the tables. Late one night, as rain pattered against the window, Karoline sat at her laptop typing furiously. She poured all the evidence into a detailed report, weaving facts and figures into a narrative that was impossible to ignore. She titled it, "The Gavel Strikes Back: How One Judge Abused Power to Protect His Interests." When she finally hit publish early the next morning, she braced herself for the fallout. Within hours, the story exploded. Social media platforms buzzed with outrage as people shared screenshots of bank statements and highlighted excerpts from whistleblower testimonies. News outlets picked up the report, running headlines that painted Judge Roberts as corrupt and self-serving. Talk shows invited legal experts to weigh in, while ordinary citizens debated the issue over coffee and dinner tables. Suddenly, the spotlight wasn't just on Karoline anymore, it was squarely on Judge Roberts. Despite the whirlwind of attention, Karoline stayed focused. She gave interviews, answered questions patiently, and made sure to emphasize that this wasn't personal. "It's not about me versus him," she said during one televised appearance. "It's about holding people in power accountable. If we don't speak up when we see wrongdoing, then who will? Her words resonated with many. Supporters flooded her social media accounts with messages of encouragement, while crowdfunding campaigns sprang up to help cover the $50,000 fine. Strangers donated whatever they could, $5 here, $20 there, because they believed in the cause she represented. Even some local businesses chipped in, hosting fundraisers and selling t-shirts with slogans like, "Truth isn't contempt," and "Speak up, stand strong." Through it all, Karoline remained grounded. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Judge Roberts still held significant influence, and the legal battle was far from over. But she also knew she wasn't alone anymore. People from all walks of life had rallied behind her, united by a shared desire for transparency and fairness. For the first time since the courtroom debacle, Karoline felt a glimmer of hope. The fight was far from over, but she had turned what could have been a crushing defeat into a rallying cry for change. The bombshell report titled, "The Gavel Strikes Back," spread like wildfire, igniting conversations in living rooms, coffee shops, and online forums across the country. People couldn't stop talking about it. Karoline's meticulous work had uncovered something that many suspected but could never prove. Judge Roberts wasn't just a biased figure. He was deeply entangled in questionable dealings that reeked of corruption. The evidence she presented wasn't vague or circumstantial. It was concrete, with bank records, emails, and first-hand testimonies backing every claim. For the first time, the public got a glimpse behind the polished facade of someone they'd trusted to uphold justice. As the story gained traction, reactions poured in from all corners. Some praised Karoline for her bravery, calling her a modern-day hero who dared to challenge the powerful. Others were skeptical, accusing her of playing dirty politics or exaggerating the facts. But even critics couldn't deny the sheer volume of evidence she had gathered. Every detail seemed to point in one direction. Judge Roberts had abused his position to protect not only himself, but also those connected to him. What made the situation even more explosive was how Judge Roberts responded, or rather how he didn't respond at first. For days he remained silent, issuing no official statement and avoiding media appearances. His silence only fueled speculation. Was he scrambling to cover his tracks? Did he underestimate how much damage Karoline's report would cause? Whatever the reason, his lack of response gave Karoline the upper hand. She used this window to keep the momentum going, releasing follow-up pieces that answered lingering questions and addressed counter-arguments head-on. Behind the scenes, though, things weren't as smooth as they appeared. Karoline knew that exposing Judge Roberts wouldn't come without consequences. True to form, he eventually struck back, but this time, his actions felt desperate rather than calculated. He filed multiple lawsuits against her, claiming defamation and demanding additional fines. He accused her of fabricating evidence and manipulating public opinion. To outsiders, it might have seemed like a legal chess match, but to those paying close attention, it felt more like retaliation, an attempt to bury her under mountains of paperwork and legal fees. But Karoline was ready for this. She had anticipated his moves long before they happened. With the help of her team, she meticulously documented everything, every email, every phone call, every interaction related to the case. They built a timeline that showed exactly when and how Judge Roberts escalated his attacks, painting a clear picture of what looked like harassment. This wasn't just about protecting herself anymore. It was about showing the world the lengths to which he would go to silence dissent. One of the most powerful moments came during a live interview on a popular news channel. The host asked Karoline directly, "Do you think these lawsuits are an attempt to intimidate you?" Without missing a beat, she leaned forward and said, "Absolutely. When you expose the truth, people in power don't always respond with honesty. Sometimes they respond with threats, lawsuits, and attempts to discredit you. But here's the thing. They can try to intimidate me all they want. They can throw every legal obstacle in my path, but they can't erase the truth." Her words resonated deeply with viewers. Social media exploded with support, with hashtags, like no to silencing and justice for Karoline trending nationwide. Even people who initially doubted her began to see the bigger picture. It wasn't just about one journalist versus one judge. It was about whether ordinary citizens could hold their leaders accountable without fear of retribution. Meanwhile, Karoline's team worked tirelessly to ensure that the public stayed informed. They created easy-to-understand infographics breaking down complex legal terms and financial transactions. They posted short videos explaining key points of the investigation, making sure the message reached as wide an audience as possible. They even set up a hotline where whistleblowers could share information anonymously, knowing that Judge Roberts' inner circle might include others willing to come forward. The pressure mounted on Judge Roberts. Local advocacy groups called for independent investigations into his conduct. Protesters gathered outside courthouses holding signs that read, "Judges should serve justice, not themselves," and "Transparency now." Politicians who once counted him as an ally began distancing themselves, fearing association with someone now seen as tainted. Even some of his colleagues on the bench started questioning his judgment, wondering if his behavior reflected poorly on the entire judicial system. Amidst the chaos, Karoline found moments of quiet reflection. Late at night, after another long day of strategizing and responding to critics, she would sit by her window, staring out at the city skyline. She thought about the risks she was taking, not just for herself but for everyone who believed in fairness and accountability. There were times when doubt crept in, whispering that maybe she had bitten off more than she could chew. But then she remembered why she started this journey in the first place. It wasn't for fame or recognition. It was because someone had to stand up, and she happened to be in a position to do so. By the end of the week, the tide had shifted dramatically. What began as a personal battle between Karoline and Judge Roberts had transformed into a national movement. People from all walks of life joined forces, united by a shared goal: to demand transparency and integrity from those in power. And while the fight was far from over, with more legal battles looming and countless hurdles still ahead, Karoline felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had taken a devastating blow and turned it into an opportunity to shine a light on systemic issues that needed fixing. In the days that followed, Judge Roberts finally broke his silence, issuing a carefully worded statement denying all allegations and accusing Karoline of orchestrating a smear campaign. But by then, the damage was done. The public had already formed its opinion, and the narrative was firmly on Karoline's side. As she scrolled through messages of support from strangers around the world, she realized something important. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It belonged to everyone who believed in justice. And together, they were stronger than any single person trying to silence them. Judge Roberts's carefully worded statement did little to quell the growing storm. If anything, it made people angrier. His denial came across as hollow, a desperate attempt to save face in front of mounting evidence that painted him in an increasingly negative light. Instead of calming the public, his words only fueled more skepticism. People began dissecting every line of his statement, comparing it to the documents and testimonies Karoline had already released. Social media lit up with memes mocking his explanation, while critics pointed out inconsistencies between what he said and what the facts showed. Karoline, on the other hand, remained calm and focused. She knew better than to engage in petty back and forth, arguments, or let her emotions get the best of her. Instead, she doubled down on presenting the truth. With her team by her side, she released another wave of information. Emails showing Judge Roberts' involvement in questionable real estate deals, financial records linking him to offshore accounts, and even audio clips from whistleblowers, describing how they were pressured into silence. Each new piece of evidence chipped away at his credibility, leaving him looking more defensive and cornered with each passing day. But Judge Roberts wasn't about to go down without a fight. He escalated his legal battle against Karoline, filing additional lawsuits and attempting to freeze her assets. This move shocked many observers, who saw it as yet another example of judicial overreach. How could someone tasked with upholding the law use it as a weapon to silence critics? The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Critics argued that his actions weren't just unethical, they bordered on tyrannical. For Karoline, this was both a challenge and an opportunity. While the legal pressure mounted, she refused to back down. Her lawyers fought tooth and nail to block his attempts to seize her assets, arguing that such measures were punitive and designed solely to intimidate her. They filed motions challenging the legitimacy of his lawsuits, pointing out glaring conflicts of interest and procedural violations. Meanwhile, Karoline used the situation to rally even more support. She went live on social media, explaining exactly what was happening and why it mattered. "When someone tries to take everything you have just because you spoke the truth," she said during one live stream, "you realize how important it is to keep speaking up, because if we don't, who will?" Her message struck a chord with millions of people. Donations poured in faster than ever before, not just from individuals but also from organizations dedicated to free speech and press freedom. Lawyers offered their services pro bono, wanting to be part of what was now being called a landmark case for accountability. Journalists wrote op-eds praising Karoline's courage, while activists organized protests outside courthouses nationwide. Even late-night talk show hosts joined in, using humor to highlight the absurdity of Judge Roberts' actions. One comedian joked, "If freezing someone's bank account is your idea of justice, maybe you're in the wrong profession." As the legal drama unfolded, something remarkable happened. The narrative shifted. What started as a personal vendetta between Karoline and Judge Roberts evolved into a broader conversation about systemic issues within the justice system. People began questioning whether judges should have unchecked power, especially when it came to punishing journalists for doing their jobs. Advocacy groups seized the moment, launching campaigns to reform contempt laws and protect whistleblowers. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at increasing transparency in judicial proceedings. For the first time in years, there was a genuine push for change, and it all stemmed from Karoline's refusal to stay silent. Despite the overwhelming support, Karoline faced moments of doubt. The constant legal battles took a toll on her physically and emotionally. Some nights she lay awake worrying about the future. Would she lose everything she had worked so hard for? Could she handle the immense pressure bearing down on her? But whenever these thoughts crept in, she reminded herself of the bigger picture. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about setting a precedent. If she gave up now, it would send a message that speaking truth to power comes with insurmountable risks, and that was something she couldn't accept. Her resolve inspired others to step forward. More whistleblowers came out of the shadows, sharing stories of corruption and misconduct they had witnessed but feared reporting. Some were former court employees who described toxic environments where dissent was punished harshly. Others were business people who revealed shady deals involving local officials tied to Judge Roberts. Each new voice added fuel to the fire, making it harder for anyone to dismiss the allegations as baseless. The turning point came when a prominent advocacy group filed a formal complaint with the State Judicial Conduct Board. Armed with Karoline's evidence and testimony from whistleblowers, they accused Judge Roberts of misconduct and demanded an immediate investigation. This move put enormous pressure on the board, which couldn't ignore the sheer volume of credible allegations. Within days, they announced plans to review the case, sending shockwaves through the legal community. Judge Roberts, once untouchable, suddenly found himself on shaky ground. Allies distanced themselves, fearing association with someone under scrutiny. Media coverage turned overwhelmingly negative, painting him as a symbol of everything wrong with the system. Even some of his colleagues privately admitted that his behavior had crossed a line. Public trust in the judiciary plummeted, with polls showing widespread dissatisfaction among citizens who felt betrayed by those meant to serve them. Through it all, Karoline stayed grounded. She continued writing articles, giving interviews, and working closely with her team to ensure the story stayed alive. But she also made time to connect with the people supporting her, whether it was responding to messages from donors or thanking volunteers helping organize protests. She never forgot that this movement belonged to everyone. It wasn't just her fight, it was theirs too. By the time the Judicial Conduct Board officially launched its investigation, the landscape had changed completely. What began as a single journalist standing up to a powerful judge had grown into a nationwide call for accountability and reform. And though the road ahead promised more challenges, Karoline felt hopeful. She had taken a stand, turned the tables, and sparked a movement that showed no signs of slowing down. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that justice might actually prevail. The investigation into Judge Roberts' conduct became the talk of the nation. Every twist and turn was dissected on news channels, debated in online forums, and shared across social media platforms. For weeks, headlines screamed about the latest developments, new evidence surfacing, whistleblowers coming forward, and even rumors of high-profile resignations from people linked to the scandal. It felt like a real-life drama unfolding right before everyone's eyes, except this wasn't fiction. This was reality, and Karoline Leavitt stood at its center, watching as the dominoes began to fall. As the Judicial Conduct Board dug deeper, more skeletons tumbled out of Judge Roberts' closet. Documents revealed that his questionable dealings weren't isolated incidents, but part of a pattern spanning years. There were emails showing how he had intervened in cases involving friends or business associates, ensuring outcomes favorable to them. Financial records exposed connections to offshore accounts tied to shell companies, a classic red flag for money laundering. And then there were the testimonies, former clerks, court staff, and even lawyers who had worked closely with him described a culture of fear within his courtroom. They spoke of how anyone who dared question his decisions faced retaliation, often subtle but always effective. Karoline played a pivotal role in keeping the momentum going. She didn't just sit back and let the investigation run its course. She actively pushed for accountability. With her team, she organized public forums where whistleblowers could share their stories safely. These events drew huge crowds, both online and offline, as ordinary citizens flocked to hear firsthand accounts of corruption. One whistleblower, a retired court employee, broke down in tears as she recounted being fired after refusing to falsify documents. Her emotional testimony struck a chord with viewers, humanizing the impact of systemic injustice. But perhaps what resonated most was how relatable the entire situation felt. People saw themselves in these stories. They imagined what it would be like to work under someone like Judge Roberts, to feel powerless against a system designed to protect the powerful. That realization sparked outrage and determination. Protesters gathered outside courthouses nationwide, holding signs that read justice shouldn't be bought and courts belong to the people. Some brought megaphones, chanting slogans demanding transparency. Others simply stood silently, holding candles as a symbol of hope for reform. Amidst the chaos, Karoline continued writing articles that connected the dots for readers. She explained complex legal terms in simple language, making sure everyone understood why this case mattered, not just for her, but for the future of justice itself. She wrote about how contempt laws could be misused to silence dissent, urging lawmakers to revisit outdated policies. She highlighted stories of other journalists and activists who had faced similar battles, reminding readers that this fight was bigger than one person. Her pieces weren't just informative, they were inspiring, calling on people to take action in whatever way they could. Judge Roberts, meanwhile, seemed to grow increasingly desperate. As the investigation tightened around him, he made a last-ditch effort to regain control of the narrative. He granted exclusive interviews to select media outlets, portraying himself as a victim of a smear campaign. In one televised appearance, he argued that Karoline's exposé was politically motivated, claiming she had fabricated evidence to tarnish his reputation. But instead of swaying public opinion, his words only deepened suspicions. Viewers noticed inconsistencies in his answers and grew frustrated by his evasive tone. Social media users mocked his performance, creating memes and hashtags like Roberts Denial Tour. The pressure eventually became too much for him to bear. Facing mounting scrutiny, Judge Roberts announced a temporary leave of absence from the bench, citing personal reasons. While he stopped short of admitting wrongdoing, his decision was widely seen as an admission of guilt. Critics pounced on the move, arguing that stepping aside was long overdue. Supporters of Karoline celebrated the development as a small victory. though they knew the real battle was far from over. After all, suspending him temporarily wasn't enough. It was time for lasting change. Behind the scenes, Karoline and her team worked tirelessly to ensure that wouldn't happen. They filed a formal complaint with higher judicial authorities, calling not just for Judge Roberts' removal, but also for reforms to prevent similar abuses of power in the future. They proposed measures like independent oversight committees to monitor judges' behavior, stricter rules around financial disclosures, and protections for whistleblowers. Their suggestions gained traction quickly, with advocacy groups endorsing them and lawmakers introducing legislation based on their ideas. Public support remained unwavering throughout. Crowdfunding campaigns raised hundreds of thousands of dollars to cover Karoline's legal fees and fines. Local businesses donated portions of their profits to her cause, while schools hosted fundraisers featuring student art inspired by themes of justice and truth. Even celebrities joined in, using their platforms to amplify her message. One actor posted a video reading excerpts from Karoline's article saying, "This is what bravery looks like." For Karoline, the outpouring of solidarity meant everything. It reminded her why she had started this journey in the first place, not for personal glory, but because someone needed to stand up when no one else would. Late at night, after another long day of strategizing and responding to critics, she often found herself scrolling through messages of gratitude from strangers. Some thanked her for giving them hope. Others shared their own experiences battling corruption, saying her courage inspired them to speak out. Each note reinforced her belief that this fight was worth every sacrifice. By the time the Judicial Conduct Board released its preliminary findings, the tide had turned completely. The Bull report painted a damning picture of Judge Roberts' actions, concluding that he had indeed abused his power and violated ethical standards. While the final decision regarding his fate rested with higher authorities, the damage to his career and reputation was irreversible. Public trust in the judiciary hit rock bottom, prompting urgent calls for reform. Lawmakers scrambled to introduce sweeping changes aimed at increasing transparency and accountability. Through it all, Karoline never lost sight of her ultimate goal. This wasn't about revenge or settling scores. It was about creating a better system for everyone. She knew the road ahead would still be challenging, but she also knew she wasn't alone anymore. Millions of people now stood beside her, united by a shared vision of fairness and integrity. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel a sense of cautious optimism. The tables had been turned, and justice, at least for now, seemed within reach. Months had passed since the Judicial Conduct Board released its damning report on Judge Roberts. The findings sent shockwaves through the legal community and beyond, sparking widespread calls for accountability and reform. While the final decision about his fate was still pending, whether he would be permanently removed from the bench or face other consequences, it was clear that his days of wielding unchecked power were over. For Karoline Leavitt, this marked a turning point not just in her personal battle but in the larger movement she had ignited. The aftermath of the scandal brought changes that no one could have predicted when it all began. Lawmakers, pressured by public outrage, introduced sweeping reforms aimed at increasing transparency within the judicial system. These included measures like requiring judges to disclose their financial dealings publicly, creating independent oversight boards to investigate misconduct, and implementing stricter penalties for those found guilty of abusing their authority. Advocacy groups hailed these developments as a victory for democracy, crediting Karoline's relentless pursuit of truth for making them possible. But for Karoline, the journey wasn't without its costs. The $50,000 fine remained unpaid, not because she refused to pay, but because legal proceedings surrounding it dragged on endlessly. Every time one lawsuit was dismissed, another seemed to pop up in its place. It felt like a never-ending game of whack-a-mole, designed to exhaust her emotionally and financially. Yet, despite the strain, she refused to let it break her spirit. She leaned on her team, her supporters, and the knowledge that she was fighting for something bigger than herself. What surprised her most was how much the movement had grown beyond her initial exposé. People from all walks of life had taken up the cause, using her story as inspiration to challenge corruption in their own communities. Teachers held classroom discussions about ethics and accountability, encouraging students to think critically about power dynamics. Journalists adopted her methods, digging deeper into stories they might otherwise have avoided out of fear. Even local governments began holding town halls where citizens could voice concerns about systemic issues, a small but meaningful step toward rebuilding trust. Karoline became a symbol of resilience, invited to speak at conferences, universities, and community events across the country. At first, she hesitated to embrace the role, feeling uncomfortable with the idea of being labeled a hero. "I'm just doing my job," she often said when asked about her motivations. But as she traveled and met people who shared their struggles with her, she realized the importance of standing firm. Her presence gave others hope, reminding them that even when the odds seem insurmountable, courage can spark change. One particularly memorable event took place in a small town hall, packed with residents eager to hear her speak. As she stood at the podium, looking out at rows of faces filled with curiosity and determination, she felt a lump form in her throat. She spoke candidly about her experiences, the sleepless nights, the moments of doubt, the overwhelming sense of responsibility. But she also talked about the victories, big and small, that kept her going. When she finished, the room erupted in applause, and dozens of people lined up to thank her personally. One elderly woman handed her a handwritten note that read, "You've reminded us that we're not powerless." Back home, Karoline continued working tirelessly, though she made a conscious effort to take care of herself too. Late-night strategy sessions gave way to quiet evenings spent reading or taking long walks. She started journaling again, something she hadn't done since her early days as a journalist. Writing helped her process everything she'd been through, the highs, the lows, and everything in between. In those pages, she poured out her fears, her hopes, and her dreams for the future. Some entries were raw and emotional. Others were filled with gratitude for the support she'd received along the way. Her team evolved as well. What began as a small group of trusted allies expanded into a network of collaborators spread across the country. Lawyers, researchers, activists, and everyday citizens joined forces, united by a shared mission to hold power accountable. Together, they tackled new cases, exposing wrongdoing wherever they found it. Each success strengthened their resolve, proving that grassroots movements could make a real difference. As the months turned into a year, Judge Roberts' name faded from headlines, replaced by stories of progress and reform. Though he technically remained suspended pending further review, his influence had dwindled to almost nothing. Former colleagues distanced themselves entirely, and his attempts to defend his actions fell flat. Meanwhile, Karoline's reputation soared. Awards rolled, in recognizing her contributions to journalism and advocacy. Yet none of those accolades meant as much to her as the messages she received daily from ordinary people whose lives had been touched by her work. In one such message, a young journalist wrote to thank her for inspiring him to pursue investigative reporting despite the risks. "Before I heard your story," he said, "I thought speaking truth to power was impossible. Now I know it's worth every challenge." Reading those words brought tears to her eyes, not because she sought validation, but because she understood the ripple effect of standing up for what's right. Change didn't happen overnight, but every act of courage planted seeds for a better tomorrow. Looking back, Karoline realized how far she'd come since that fateful day in the courtroom. What started as a single act of defiance had grown into a nationwide movement, igniting conversations about justice, integrity, and accountability. She knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be battles to wage and systems to improve, but she also knew the tide was shifting. People were waking up, demanding more from their leaders and refusing to accept silence in the face of injustice. On a crisp autumn morning, Karoline sat at her desk, staring at a blank document on her laptop screen. She smiled softly, knowing exactly what to write next. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing the first sentence. This is a story about courage, the kind that starts with one person willing to say enough is enough. As she wrote, she reflected on the journey ahead. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of uncertainty, but there would also be victories, large and small, each one bringing the world closer to the justice it deserved. And so, Karoline pressed on, not as a lone crusader, but as part of a collective force determined to shine light into the darkest corners of society. Her story proved that while power could intimidate, it couldn't silence forever. Truth, after all, has a way of finding its voice, and once unleashed, it refuses to be ignored.